Hello, and welcome to Middle East Focus, a weekly podcast on regional affairs and U.S. policy, produced by the Middle East Institute in Washington, D.C. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editor-in-chief.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj, managing editor at MEI. The campaign to neutralize Turkey's main opposition continues to expand in various ways, with the authorities recently delivering new charges against Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu, widely seen as President Recep Tayyip Erdoğan's most serious political rival. At the same time, the Turkish government's talks with Abdullah Öcalan, the imprisoned leader of the Kurdistan Workers' Party, or PKK, continue apace, and the group has now announced that it will withdraw its fighters from Turkey to northern Iraq. If successful, the so-called Kurdish process could pave the way for a change in the constitution, enabling Erdogan to extend his rule by running again in the next elections, set to be held by mid-2028.
What is the government's strategy behind its attacks on the main opposition party? How likely are we to see a true resolution of the long-standing Kurdish issue? And as Erdogan seeks to enhance Turkey's position on the world stage with moves in Gaza and Syria, as well as efforts to shore up ties with Western partners, how is all of this impacting his standing back home? To explore all of these questions and more, we're joined on this week's episode by MEI Senior Fellow Gönül Tol. Gönül's work focuses on Turkish politics, U.S.-Turkey relations, political Islam, and regional dynamics in the Middle East. She's the author of the book Erdogan's War, A Strongman's Struggle at Home and in Syria, and the host of the MEI podcast, Rethinking Democracy.
Our listeners can subscribe to both Middle East Focus and Gönül's Rethinking Democracy on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast providers. And please additionally check out MEI's other podcast, Taking the Edge Off the Middle East, with Brian Katulis.
Gönül, welcome to Middle East Focus.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back on the program. We've got a lot of ground to cover here, so let's dive right in. I want to start with the cases against Istanbul Mayor Ekrem İmamoğlu of the main opposition Republican People's Party, or CHP. That's what kickstarted the whole crackdown earlier this year and has been the most high-profile single aspect of it. Just to recap for our listeners, İmamoğlu was originally brought up on charges of corruption and fraudulently obtaining a university diploma back in March. Charges that I should underscore are widely viewed as baseless and politically motivated. Before we move on to more recent developments, what's the latest on those previous cases?
Well, as you said, there's a number of cases against İmamoğlu, which places him under immense legal pressure. The one that you were referring to in March 2025, and that's when İmamoğlu was arrested. He was arrested on multiple corruption and terrorism-linked charges, allegations of tender rigging, bribery, money laundering, and aiding the PKK. And that was in October. A Turkish court acquitted İmamoğlu in that corruption case. But there are others. In July 2025, a court convicted him of insulting and threatening Istanbul's chief public prosecutor and sentenced him to 1 year, 8 months in prison. And that verdict is being appealed. And also in 2025, he faces a separate investigation into the alleged falsification of his university diploma, which is a further potential disqualification from office. And there is now a new case. On October 27th, prosecutors launched a new file accusing him of political espionage. The allegations include raising funds for a future presidential bid through illicit means and seeking foreign backing. So he is charged, and people in his team, is charged with coordinating with a businessman who was detained in July for intelligence work allegedly for foreign governments. And that investigation also involves the editor-in-chief of an opposition broadcaster, Tele1, and his former campaign manager. Well, obviously, İmamoğlu denies the charges and calls them politically motivated. But I think the timing of the new arrest order, while he was already jailed on other charges, makes a significant escalation in his legal and political predicament. I would say under a functioning rule of law, none of these charges would make it past a prosecutor's desk. So legally, they have no standing whatsoever.
Is it fair to say they're throwing kind of everything in the kitchen sink at him at this point?
That's exactly right. Erdogan is pushing all the buttons to make sure that İmamoğlu remains in jail until 2028 elections.
So the campaign against the CHP may have started with İmamoğlu, but it has since expanded well beyond him in the kind of intervening months. Where do things stand on that kind of broader crackdown on the CHP? Can you give our listeners a sense of the kind of size and scope of that? How many mayors are we talking about? How many officials? Who all's been arrested at this point?
Well, recently, a court rejected the case against the CHP. The case against the CHP was designed to remove the current very energetic CHP leader, Özgür Özel, and replace him with the previous leader, Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu, who is very unpopular. And I think obviously that's good news, but that doesn't mean that there's improvement in Turkey's rule of law. I think the court rejected the case mainly because the CHP chairman, Özgür Özel, did something very smart. So he held an extraordinary congress after the lawsuit was filed, and he replaced all delegates and effectively that nullified the legal grounds of the case. So I think Erdogan's decision, the court's decision, just reflects a tactical move on Erdogan's part, but I think his broader policy of squeezing the CHP by whatever means necessary remains intact. And as for the rallies that have been going on since March, I was recently in Turkey and I saw that firsthand. There are still tens of thousands of people attending those rallies. And I think that's remarkable because many people thought that keeping people mobilized was going to be a very difficult thing for the main opposition. And it is really difficult because people who are attending those rallies are taking a huge risk. And yet they show up every time. So Özgür Özel is holding two rallies, one in Istanbul every Wednesday, another in somewhere else in the country. So people pretty much see it as the last exit before Erdogan finally moves to turn the ballot box into something meaningless. So that's why people keep turning up because they see that this as a last resort. Currently, there are 16 CHP mayors behind bars and hundreds of CHP officials are jailed. So Erdogan, I think his strategy is to make sure he's trying to turn the CHP into the pro-Kurdish party. Erdogan has long framed the pro-Kurdish party as a marginal group tied to terrorism and criminalized the party and its political elites. So that's what Erdogan is trying to do now to the main opposition party. And I think we should remind our viewers that the CHP since 2024 municipal elections remains the most popular party in the country, but that's Erdogan's strategy.
I want to drill down in a little bit more detail on this October 24th decision that you alluded to, where they threw out the charges against the CHP Party Congress and the election of the party head, Özgür Özel. That seems kind of contradictory to this broader push against the CHP. What do you think accounts for that? You said it's not a victory for Turkish judicial independence. What are the kind of possible motivations there? What's your read on the tea leaves on that?
I think, again, this was a tactical move. I mean, the broader strategy remains intact. And I think part of the reason is, again, Özgür Özel made these brilliant moves. And the second one is the tens of thousands of people who just take to the streets every week. And I think that somewhat made Erdogan to put the brakes on this because we're talking about a party that was established by Turkey's founding father, Atatürk. And if this is any indication, this year, on the anniversary of Atatürk's death, more than 1 million people went to visit his tomb. So this is a sign that Turks are incredibly worried about the party, the main opposition party, and Erdogan's legacy. So Erdogan could have sensed that this could backfire. basically designing the CHP along his vision. So I think that is the number one reason. But again, that doesn't mean that he's gonna change tactics. I think he will continue to pressure the party going forward.
As you alluded to earlier, there's also been a further crackdown on the media side of things with the seizure of that pro-opposition television channel, Tele 1. How much space is there for the opposition to get its message out at this point? Can it actually communicate with the broader public when there's such an asymmetry in terms of kind of access to or control of the media?
Well, the space is certainly much less. I mean, you still have opposition, pro-opposition channels like Halk TV, Sözcü TV, and they are the most widely watched networks. And that is significant because we're talking about a regime that has invested so much in its own media sector, and they pour a lot of money into those, and yet even many of Erdogan's own supporters do not trust those news channels and newspapers to get the news. So they watch these pro-opposition channels. So that is important. And yet, I think all those channels also suffer constantly from legal attacks and blackouts. So I think the space for democratic opposition is shrinking. And I think that's one of the reasons why so many people are protesting on the streets. So when I was in Turkey, I spoke with people who attended Özgür Özel's rallies, and these are people, young people, old people, families who came with their young children. So when you ask them, so why do you keep showing up? This is difficult. This is risky. And again, they say that this is the last exit. And we know that Erdogan's next move is going to be to remove the ballot box. And Turkish people, we have to remember that this practice of democracy, being able to choose their own leaders, it's been so deep rooted in Turkish political culture that people will not just walk away from that, right? So they are resisting, and they see the streets as the only remaining and most effective space that's now available to them.
Taking a look at the government side of things, what do you think its longer term objectives are in all of this? Is it just about laying the groundwork for 2028 and the upcoming elections? Are there any signs that they're giving thought to what comes after that, or?
Well, I think obviously Erdogan's number one goal is to make sure that he remains in power beyond 2028. And he's already taken the very significant steps to make sure that happens, including this talks with the PKK. So marginalizing or trying to criminalize the CHPs is part of that strategy. But I think Erdogan is also looking at his legacy now. So he certainly wants to undo Kemal Atatürk's reforms. He's certainly changed a lot of things in Turkey, and for the next government, it's going to be extremely challenging to undo all the damage that he's done to Turkish democracy. But I think on some level, he has been unsuccessful, and he talks about that all the time. He says, we have done many things in this country, but we weren't able to establish a cultural hegemony, meaning that still, as I said, millions of people go and visit Atatürk, and they really value those secular principles, democratic secular principles. So on some level, Erdogan has really transformed the country in his image, but on another level, he was not successful. So I think he's now looking at how he will be remembered. So he wants to undo all those the secular reforms that were initiated by Atatürk.
Talk about legacy. Erdogan is, of course, in his younger 70s at this point, and that inevitably raises the question of succession. How do you think the dynamics around that play into all of this?
Well, it's difficult to tell because we're talking about a handful of people who are making key decisions, right? And they're not often public, so you just have to guess. And if I had to guess, I would say, knowing Erdogan, he would never trust someone who is not his blood. And I've been seeing a lot of international media framing people in his close circle, like the Turkish foreign minister or the intelligence chief, as Erdogan's successor. I'm having a hard time understanding how they come up with that. For me, I think if someone is going to take over after Erdogan, I think Erdogan would certainly prefer a family member, like his son, Bilal Erdogan. But if you ask me if that would do the trick, I doubt it, because these populist leaders like Erdogan or Trump in this country, it's really difficult to replicate them, because they have formed these almost magic chemistry with their supporters that, once they're gone, you don't have the same kind of bond and chemistry. So yes, I know people often talk about these succession plans, but I doubt what we see in international media it really reflects what Erdogan has in mind.
We now wanted to turn to the government's discussions with the Kurds. It's come to be known as the Kurdish process. And I wonder if you could first kind of explain to our listeners, what do we mean by that? Who's involved? What are some of the moving parts? And what are the various sides trying to get out of these talks?
Sure. Recently, the government launched an opening. There's much debate about what to call the whole process. So in Turkey, the government calls it the process. If you're more enthusiastic about it, people call it the peace process. The government launched these talks with the PKK imprisoned leader, and the way it was framed by the government was that, this is an effort to force the PKK to disarm and disband itself. And the main driver behind this was Devlet Bahçeli, Erdogan's nationalist ally, who built a career on repressing the Kurds. So it came from him. He initiated this. He's become the strongest supporter of this, and he also framed this as an effort to make sure that the PKK is no longer there. So that's why the nationalist constituency that supports President Erdogan and Devlet Bahçeli, they see this as a great opportunity. But if you talk to the skeptics, they see this as Erdogan's efforts to make sure that he remains the president for life. And I'm one of them. I think that the main goal here is to make sure that there's a new constitution. The current constitution does not allow Erdogan to rerun in 2028. So Erdogan is trying to secure the support of the pro-Kurdish party in the parliament, which is a big party with many seats, to make sure they support his efforts to either call for early elections or draft a new constitution that will allow him to rerun. So that is the primary goal. But again, if you ask the Kurds, the pro-Kurdish party, they see this as a historic opportunity. The PKK recently took a historic step, said that it's withdrawing from Turkey, that it's going to disarm and disband. But the process itself has several different pieces, and I think part of the process is going well, but there are still problematic pieces.
One of the leaders of one of these pro-Kurdish parties, the People's Equality and Democracy Party, or DEM, he recently spoke about this need to, quote, implement a transition of law and democratic integration laws. What did he mean by this? And do you see this as something that is actually feasible in the current Turkish political climate?
Well, that's one of the key things and one of the most contentious parts, I think. So if you ask me how people view this Öcalan talks, I would say that the different parties, they view different constituencies in a different light. I see a lot of optimism among Kurdish political elite, and with a few caveats, I think. So they think the pro-Kurdish party, them representatives, they talk about these two different tracks. So the first track involves granting Kurds constitutional rights. And that involves language rights, something that the pro-Kurdish party has been pushing for decades. So they want to be able to have access to Kurdish education in public schools. And the second Kurdish demand has been changing the definition of Turkish citizenship along civic lines. So the DEM party representatives say that the government and the Kurds are on the same page when it comes to that first track. But there's a second track that's more problematic, and that involves granting amnesty to the PKK members and PKK fighters. So right now, the government is working on a plan to make sure those PKK members who were not involved in violence are able to come back, return to Turkey, and they will be granted amnesty. Now, the problem there is we don't know what will happen to the top leadership of the PKK, because the top leadership, the names, they've become household names in Turkey, right? So if you grant them amnesty, then you can face a nationalist backlash there. And that's what Erdogan is afraid of. And there's another even more problematic aspect, and that is the top leadership of the PKK, they demand not just an amnesty, but they want to be able to go back to Turkey and enter politics. Again, that's a very problematic thing from a nationalist point of view. So those are the two very difficult aspects of the Kurdish peace process. But Kurdish political elite, they are incredibly optimistic, and they think that particularly Devlet Bahçeli is so enthusiastic about the whole thing that he will make sure that problems will be resolved and this will move forward. Erdogan himself is a little bit more cautious than Devlet Bahçeli because he thinks Kurds failed him before. This is not the first peace talks that he's launched. There were two previous ones. So Erdogan's reading of those previous two openings was that Kurds failed me. And he's really afraid of a public reaction because in his mind he had paid a political cost because of the previous opening. So he's treading really cautiously there. And then you have the CHP and the opposition constituency. They are a lot more skeptical because they see this whole opening as Erdogan's efforts to consolidate power beyond 2028, and they are incredibly skeptical, and they argue that this is a time when Erdogan has been trying to undermine the remaining pillars of democracy, and the pro-Kurdish party is just aiding those efforts.
How does what is happening across the border in Syria affect the situation in Turkey when it comes to these talks with the Kurds? What are the kind of external factors that are influencing some of these developments inside of Turkey?
I think that's another very complicating factor, right? So if you talk to the pro-Kurdish MPs, they argue that we have hurdles facing us, but domestically, but we can overcome them. So that is the narrative. But they are not as optimistic about the Syria piece of all this because everything that is linked to the peace process, Öcalan and Turkey's Kurds, there's a strong Syria angle there, right? So that's why it's closely linked to what the Syrian Kurds are doing with their own central government. And they have been holding talks. There was an agreement reached in March where the Syrian Kurdish militia agreed to integrate into the Syrian National Army. But there have been a lot of problems since then. There are disagreements because the Syrian Kurds look at what has happened in southern Syria, Suaida, where there was violence against this minority, Druze minority. And they look at what has happened to Alawites in the coastal regions in Syria and the violence that they had to endure. And their conclusion is that we cannot lay down arms. We cannot give up on the institutional structures that we have set up because we don't think this new government in Damascus is stable. We don't think it's going to last long. So that's why we have to hold on to the arms and the institutions that we have set up. So that's their narrative. And Damascus is looking at these incidents, and they have been drawing a completely different conclusion. Damascus had granted a limited autonomy to Druze community in the south. So Syrian President Ahmed al-Shara thinks this is what happens when you grant even a limited autonomy to minorities. They invite international intervention, referring to the Israeli military actions and efforts to protect the Druze minority there. So he sees that as problematic, and that's why he wants to make sure that the Syrian Kurds, they don't have any autonomous, they don't control autonomous zones, they don't control autonomous institutions. So both sides are now in a place where they don't want to grant any concessions to the other side. So that's a huge problem for Erdogan and for the Öcalan opening. Because let's imagine for a moment that they managed to overcome all the domestic hurdles and the Kurds and the government reached an agreement domestically. But how can Erdogan credibly claim that he finished the PKK? That the PKK has been disbanded and disarmed when the PKK's sister organization across the border still controls this autonomous region, and they are armed and they have their own security institutions. So that's why what's happening in the Syrian theater is incredibly important to the Öcalan peace talks. And recently, the Syrian foreign minister said that the talks with the Syrian Kurds have been stalled. So that's not good news for Erdogan.
We mentioned earlier some of the PKK is now talking about withdrawing to northern Iraq. In what way is that situation different from what's happening in Syria from the Turkish point of view?
First of all, there are not that many PKK militants who operate in Turkey anyway. Since 2015, Turkish army has been waging this war, which has become very effective against the PKK, and not just against the armed elements of the group, but also the civil society, Kurdish civil society, Kurdish municipalities. And that fight has been incredibly effective. So compared to the peak years of PKK Turkish state fight, there are just very few PKK militants left in Turkey. So that is pretty much, from the PKK's point of view, a symbolic act, saying that we are withdrawing from Turkey. But when it comes to Syria, I think from PKK's point of view, they understand that they have been defeated militarily, right? Even in northern Iraq, the drone war that Turkey has been waging has been so effective. There are so many military outposts, Turkish military outposts in northern Iraq now, that the PKK has been really squeezed militarily. And also, I should add, the PKK has long enjoyed this public support among Turkey's Kurdish constituency, right? And that support has been waning as well. And the PKK's decision in 2015 to carry the fight into the cities from the mountains, I think that was a turning point, and that really undermined local support that the PKK had enjoyed for many decades, because Kurdish people in Turkey, they're just fed up. They just want to live in peace. They don't want to be getting killed both by the government and the PKK's operations. So that's why that public support is also eroding. So from the PKK's point of view, this was a decision that almost it had to take. But Syria is a completely different story, both from the PKK's point of view, Öcalan's point of view, and Erdogan's point of view, because PKK looks at Syria, and I should add, Öcalan also looks at Syria and the experiment there, the Kurdish experiment there, and they see this as a great achievement. So I think their narrative is that, okay, we may have withdrawn from Turkey, we may have decided to disarm, but there will always be Syria. We're talking about a large Syrian Kurdish militia that's been trained and armed by the United States. I think compared to the Syrian National Army, it's even stronger than than the Syrian National Army. This is a very capable military force we're talking about. So that's why it poses a larger risk to what Erdogan wants to do. It's posing a larger risk to Ahmet al-Shara's plans. But from the PKK and Öcalan's point of view, it's a success story.
But also from the PKK's perspective, it's a place where they've actually tried to implement some of these Öcalanist political ideas in terms of how the government actually operates and all that stuff as well, too. So
That's exactly right. And that's why I think there were recent reports suggesting that the Turkish government had asked Öcalan to call on the Syrian Kurds to give up on the autonomous region, Kurdish autonomous region. I don't think that will happen. I don't think Öcalan wants to be remembered as the leader who had asked the Syrian Kurds to give up on one of their greatest achievements. That's how the Kurds see that, as a great achievement. So it's going to be very difficult. But the question is obviously, then is there a middle ground? I mean, is there a middle ground between what the Syrian Kurds and Öcalan want for Kurds in Syria and what Ahmet al-Shara and Erdogan are willing to grant, right? So I think both demands are maximalist demands. You have a central government in Syria who wants to make sure that there's a strong central government. They don't want to give an inch. And then you have the Syrian Kurds who think that they can continue to operate in the framework that they have been operating since the uprisings began in Syria. So those are both maximalist and not realistic for everyone involved, including Öcalan, Erdogan, and Ahmet al-Shara. The middle ground would be a scenario where the Kurds continue to retain some of those autonomous powers, not on paper. No one wants to call it a federal structure. No one wants to call it an autonomous region. And yet, practically, they will continue to operate and retain some autonomy. They will be integrated into the Syrian National Army, but maybe under a different name that will allow Erdogan and the Turkish government to claim that they've ended the Syrian Kurdish experiment in Syria.
certainly a complicated, interlocking set of issues there, and ones we'll be continuing to discuss in the months ahead. I want to pivot now to something a little bit closer to home here in Washington and talk about Turkey and the U.S. Erdogan, of course, visited the White House in late September following UN General Assembly to meet with President Trump. What came out of that visit? What did he manage to secure from Trump? What's the kind of state of play on that relationship?
I would say not much. If you look at the concrete results that meeting produced. So let's talk about Erdogan's goals first. Number one goal, I think, was a photo op to boost his legitimacy at home. This meeting came against the background of escalating repression against the main opposition party, right? So Erdogan wanted to make sure that by shaking hands with President Trump in front of cameras, he wanted the CHP and the pro-democracy forces at home to understand that, the world does not care about your struggle. And on some level, he achieved that because President Trump praised Erdogan and gave him the head seat at a meeting in New York on the sidelines of the United Nations. But there were also Oval Office jokes about Erdogan, quote unquote, knowing rigged elections. Right? So that was one of the things that President Trump said during that meeting. And then you had Trump envoy Tom Barrack saying Trump gave him what he needed most, which was legitimacy. So all those things really diluted the win in a sense. And the second demand from Erdogan was on CAATSA and defense, CAATSA sanctions. This has been something that's really important to Erdogan's not only foreign agenda, but also domestic agenda. The sanctions that had been put in place by President Trump during his first term really hurt Turkey's defense sector. And Erdogan wanted to make sure that President Trump lifts those sanctions. So those sanctions involve American sale of F-35s and jet engines and other critical parts. I think the Turkish side understands that purchasing the F-35s is close to impossible because that requires changing another piece of U.S. legislation, which is called the NDAA, and President Trump alone cannot do that himself. But so that's why the Turkey side has been pushing President Trump to lift the CAATSA sanctions. So there, Trump has room to maneuver. And in fact, before the meeting, Trump hinted he could lift sanctions if Ankara gave him what he wanted, which is Turkey ending Russian oil imports. And obviously, that's a huge ask, right? It's something that Turkey cannot do overnight. And then you had Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan admitting Turkey's indigenous fighter jet is stalled without U.S. engines, which sparked a debate in Ankara. So there too, you understand that the two sides, the two presidents were not really on the same page, and Trump did not actually grant what Erdogan wanted the most. And there was this other case, Halkbank case. Halkbank is a state-owned Turkish bank, and there's a court case against it in New York for circumventing Iranian sanctions. And the bank has been expecting a huge fine in the tunes of $2 billion. And if that actually happened, that would really hurt Turkish economy. So Erdogan has been trying very hard to make sure that that court case goes away. So in his meeting with President Trump, he pushed the American president to take steps. And I think there was an agreement where Erdogan pledged that the bank would pay $100 million, which is a lot less than the Turks had expected. So that's good news for Erdogan. But there was another interesting angle to that, which was Halkbank is not going to plead guilty to the charges. So why is that important? Because Erdogan and his family, his names are mentioned in the indictment. So Erdogan is trying to make sure that future American administrations won't launch another investigation into him or his family. Obviously, there's no guarantee. But apparently, that was one of the few concrete things that this meeting had achieved. And there was also the Syria file, obviously. And I think their positive messaging, both presidents saying that they are on the same page. Erdogan has been asking several things from the U.S. administration, including ending cooperation with the Syrian Kurds, and President Trump weighing in on Israeli actions there. So I think Turkish president secured a pledge from the American president on that front too. So I think overall, the bottom line here is Erdogan got optics and a partial Halkbank deal, but I think there's been little movement on others. So for a long-sought White House visit, I think Ankara gave up a lot, pledged to purchase U.S. planes and signed an energy deal which will require Turkey to pay billions of dollars. So I think, again, Ankara gave up a lot and gained little.
You touched on Syria briefly, but there are a number of other areas where Turkey's trying to kind of position itself to play a role in, but also benefit from U.S. policy in the Middle East. Can you maybe touch on those, especially the issue of Gaza, and how is all of that playing domestically as well?
Well, the Gaza angle, I think it has a strong domestic link because last year in 2024, Turkey held municipal elections in which Erdogan's ruling party lost almost all cities to the opposition. And the way Erdogan read the results was striking. After the elections, he said that I think we were not able to communicate where we stand on the Gaza question to our constituency. So he thought that the Gaza issue played a huge role in his election loss. So whether that's true or not, we don't know, but that's how Erdogan sees it. And that's why he's being more vocal since those elections in his criticism of Israel. His narrative about Gaza, what's happening there, Israeli policies, what Netanyahu is trying to do, those are the things that are really important to Erdogan's domestic agenda. So that's why I think the Turkish side decided to host this meeting on the sidelines of Anga in New York, where Erdogan convened a group of Muslim leaders in New York, and he was given the head table along with President Trump. Erdogan media focused on that picture a lot, framing that as Trump's green light to Erdogan and framing of him and viewing him as the leader of the Muslim world and as the only leader who can fix the Gaza problem. So that had a strong domestic constituency. And Trump himself also framed the Gaza ceasefire as a huge achievement of Erdogan too. But I think there were already also risks involved in Erdogan's throwing his support behind the so-called Trump-Gaza peace plan, right? Because at the end of the day, Erdogan frames himself as this strong champion of the Palestinian cause. And he is in many ways. But on the other hand, we don't know what that Gaza peace plan, Trump plan, will produce in terms of a Palestinian two-state solution, or what will happen to the Gazans who are living there if efforts to evacuate Gaza, if it actually succeed, that is not going to be a good picture domestically for President Erdogan.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a number of challenges emerge already. So
That's exactly right.
Turkey also hosted a sort of follow-up summit of regional actors, Saudi, Qatar, Indonesia, Pakistan, etc., in Istanbul this week. What came out of that, and did that advance the kind of Turkish effort at all, do you think?
No, I think it's a very complicated thing, right? Because on the one hand, yes, President Trump says that, I can restrain Netanyahu. This administration talked about how it has prevented Netanyahu from annexing the West Bank. Every once in a while, they talk about the two-state solution. But on the other hand, so many things have already happened on the ground that prevents a two-state solution, right? I mean, West Bank already, the settlers, what's happening there already is very problematic from a leader like Erdogan, who says that he's the strongest supporter of a two-state solution. So that's why I think it's a very complicated picture. On the one hand, Erdogan is really trying hard to frame himself as the leader, the world leader, the regional leader who has done the most to advance the Palestinian cause. But on the other hand, he's also trying to cultivate these closer ties with President Trump. And he's really mindful of the fact that he's trying not to alienate, not to anger President Trump. So that's a very fine line. And I think that really comes at the expense of finding a reasonable, just solution to the Palestinian problem.
Shifting gears somewhat, I also wanted to touch on the issue of defense. We've seen a number of recent European overtures to Turkey on this. Turkey's defense sector has grown rapidly in recent years. It's had some real success stories. I think everyone knows the Bayraktar drone, for instance. But it's also become a real political symbol for the AKP and a story of kind of Turkey's success and greatness for its political base. What's happening there, and why is that important?
Well, it is important because since Erdogan and the ruling AKP lost municipal elections in 2019, that was a significant loss. We're talking about almost all major cities lost to the main opposition. So why is that important? You could say it's just municipal elections. It's not going to do anything to Erdogan's rule. But at the end of the day, Erdogan used the financial resources those municipalities had to offer to finance his regime. So losing that source of revenue was a big deal for Erdogan. And since then, Erdogan has turned to foreign policy and Turkey's defense sector. The defense sector, Erdogan's son-in-law is in charge of that. And Erdogan is using Turkey's indigenous defense products not just to generate funds, much needed funds, because Turkish economy is struggling, but he's also using that to boost his leverage on the foreign policy front. Now, from Sudan to Azerbaijan to other African countries, Turkish drones from Ukraine, Turkish drones have become very popular. And Erdogan has been signing all these defense deals with foreign countries. So the defense sector is very important. And he's also driving legitimacy from that. If you remember in 2023, when Turkey held presidential elections, Erdogan campaigned on Turkey's defense products.
I remember the posters.
That's exactly right. So that's why the defense sector has become incredibly important. And the international environment, I think, has provided an opening to Erdogan and his defense sector. So you have President Trump's return to the White House, and we know how Trump feels about NATO and defending Europe. So European countries, they have to build up their own defense, not only to protect Ukraine, but also they think that what Trump is doing with NATO is going to be a long-term trend. So that's why they are worried. And they turn to Erdogan. Just recently, Germany lifted its long-held veto on the sale of Eurofighter jets to Turkey. Initially, Germany vetoed that decision, basically saying that it was concerned about human rights and the rule of law, and this came shortly after Ekrem İmamoğlu's arrest. And now, all of a sudden, a few months after that, as if Turkey's democratic prospects had improved dramatically, Germany lifted the veto. So all these things tell you how Erdogan is using the defense sector and all these agreements with foreign countries, military agreements. He's using those not just to generate revenues, but also to boost his the leverage on the foreign policy front.
But just to wrap up here, I wanted to refocus back on sort of the core issue we've been talking about through this entire episode, which is the state of Turkey's democracy. If you were to take its temperature today, how would you assess it? And are you confident or worried about the state of Turkish democracy, its institutions, its political culture going forward?
I'm extremely worried because the steps that Erdogan has been taking, they are unprecedented steps. Erdogan has been in power for more than 2 decades, and he had already been taking incremental steps, right, when it comes to undermining Turkish democracy. But there was no Rubicon where, you could just pinpoint to one Erdogan decision that will lead you to say, okay, that was it. That was the turning point in terms of turning Turkey from a problematic democracy into an autocracy. So those were all small incremental steps. But what we've been seeing this year is just dramatic escalation. And I think Ekrem İmamoğlu's arrest is very significant, is a turning point in that regard. Because we are used to seeing Erdogan taking these small, tiny steps in that direction, but arresting his top rival, a guy who had beat him at the ballot box several times before, who is the mayor of Turkey's largest city, the financial capital, at a time when Erdogan was trying to lure foreign investors back into the country. So that was a dramatic step, even by Erdogan's standards. That tells us that Erdogan thinks that no one will care. He thinks he will look at the international environment. He will look at the developments here in this country, in the United States under President Trump, and he will think, I can do whatever I want. So that really worries me the most. But I'm also hopeful, having been to Turkey recently and talked to people who are still resisting. I'm hopeful because I know that the Turkish people know what democracy is, what it means to be able to elect their own leaders. And they think that right is really precious. So they simply will not walk away.
Well, I think we'll have to leave it there. That's all the time we have for this week. And Gönül, thank you so much for joining us on the program today.
Thanks for having me.
And a warm thanks also goes out to our listeners for tuning in, as well as to our production team for all of their work on this week's episode.
To find MEI's latest coverage of Turkey and to subscribe to Gönül's podcast, Rethinking Democracy, please visit our website at www.mei.edu.
You can also follow MEI on X, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube, and subscribe to our email newsletters for the latest analysis and information about upcoming events.
I'm Alistair Taylor.
And I'm Matthew Czekaj. We hope you'll listen in again next week.